Before anything existed, before light, before time itself had a name, there was only darkness, a vast, infinite, breathless darkness that stretched in every direction without end, and in the middle of that darkness, a single point of golden light began to pulse, slowly at first, then stronger, like a heartbeat that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be noticed. This is not a story that begins on Earth. This story begins somewhere far older than Earth, somewhere that human language has always struggled to describe, a realm of such overwhelming beauty and order that every attempt to picture it falls short. But we will try, because this story matters, because what happened in that realm changed everything that has ever happened since, including the very moment you are sitting in right now. In that place beyond time, there existed a court, a throne room so vast that its walls dissolved into clouds of golden light on every side, and in that space, countless beings of radiant fire moved and stood and sang in perfect formation. They were called angels, and they were extraordinary, each one unique, each one powerful beyond anything the human mind can easily hold, and each one perfectly devoted to the presence that sat at the center of it all. The throne itself was not made of gold or stone, it was made of something living, something that burned and breathed and radiated warmth outward in every direction like a sun that never faded, and the one who sat upon it was the source of everything, the beginning of every good thing that has ever existed, a presence so complete that standing in it felt like finally understanding what you were always meant to be. Among all those angelic beings, one stood apart, not because he was separate from the others, but because he was more brilliant, more beautiful, more commanding. When he moved through the celestial halls, the others made space for him without thinking about it. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that other voices simply did not have. His name was Lucifer, and in those early ages of heaven, that name meant something. It meant the one who carries the light. He was not arrogant in those days, or if he was, it was the kind of pride that comes naturally to someone who has never been anything less than extraordinary. He had been made for this closeness to the throne, for this role of reflecting divine glory outward into the cosmos. He was the most exquisite instrument in all of creation, and he knew it. But in those earliest days, that knowing sat quietly inside him, covered over by the genuine or being close to the one who had made him. Then something happened, something that would set in motion the longest war in the history of the universe. Not a war fought with swords or armies in the traditional sense, a war fought in whispers and choices in the invisible space between trust and doubt, a war that is still being fought today, in your home, in your mind, in the quiet moments when you wonder whether anyone is actually listening when you pray. But before we get there, you need to understand something important about what Lucifer was given access to, because the thing he was taught in those throne room sessions would become the most powerful weapon he ever tried to use, and the most spectacular failure he ever experienced. And those two things are not separate, they are the same thing. That is the part of the story that almost nobody tells. God called Lucifer to stand before the throne, and what happened in those meetings changed the entire trajectory of everything that came after. Because God did not simply assign Lucifer tasks or give him a position and a title and send him on his way. God taught him, specifically and deliberately and with extraordinary detail. God explained to Lucifer how prayer worked. Think about that for a moment. The one who would become the greatest enemy of prayer was given a private education in prayer by the one who invented it. He was shown the pathways. He was shown how the connection formed. He was shown how the golden threads of communication between creator and creation moved through the cosmos, finding their way to the throne with unerring accuracy. He was shown what strengthened those threads and what weakened them. He was shown everything. And Lucifer listened. He listened the way only a being of his particular intelligence could listen, not just with his ears, but with the deep filing systems of his vast mind, recording every detail, organizing every piece of information, understanding, with a precision that was almost frightening, exactly how this system worked and exactly what could interrupt it. At the time, the information was given in a spirit of worship. This is how connected the Creator is to creation. This is how much the Maker desires relationship with what has been made. This is the beauty of the prayer system. This is why it matters. Lucifer received all of it. He nodded. He bowed. He reflected the appropriate reverence back outward. But inside, something was beginning to shift. Something so subtle that it would not become visible for a long time. Something that perhaps he himself did not fully recognize yet. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Out beyond the courts of heaven, in the vast canvas of the cosmos, creation was beginning, and it was breathtaking. Stars erupted into existence one by one in an expanding darkness that was slowly being pushed back, not randomly, not chaotically, each one placed with intention, each one burning with purpose. A universe being built with the care of an artist who has all the time in the world and every reason to make it beautiful. Then, in a small corner of that vast creation, a single planet, blue and green and breathing, And on that planet, something unprecedented. Not angels, not beings of fire and light. Something more fragile, more vulnerable. Something made of dust and breath, and the specific, shocking dignity of having been made in the image of the Creator himself, humans. And with their arrival, everything changed, not because humans were more powerful than angels. They were not. Not because they were more beautiful or more intelligent or more capable. They were none of those things. But because of the way God related to them. There was something in the divine attention that turned toward these small, breathing creatures that Lucifer had never seen directed at him or at any other angelic being. Something intimate. Something that could only be described as delight. God walked with them, in the cool of the evenings, moving through the garden that had been made for them, talking with them the way you talk with someone you love more than anything, laughing with them, listening to them, being fully present with them in a way that made the entire celestial court stop and watch with something like wonder. Lucifer watched too. And this is where the first fracture appeared. It was not the watching that was the problem. It was what the watching produced inside him. A question, a comparison, a calculation that his vast and brilliant mind began running without being asked to. Who are these creatures? Why do they receive this kind of attention? What do they have that I do not? He began to spend more time at the edge of the heavenly realm, looking down at the garden below, watching God walk with the humans, watching the laughter and the conversation and the ease of it. And inside him, something that had never been there before was taking shape, something dark and corrosive and deeply dangerous. Not hatred, not yet, but envy, the quiet, devastating kind that disguises itself as reasonable inquiry until it has done all its damage. The sessions with God about prayer continued, and now Lucifer listened with a different quality of attention. Now, he was not filing the information away in a spirit of worship. He was filing it away in a spirit of strategy. Every detail about how prayer worked became a note in a different kind of document. Not a hymn but a blueprint. Not a revelation but a weapon being assembled in the dark. He began to gather others. Not loudly. Not in open rebellion. In quiet corners of the celestial realm, where the conversations could stay below the threshold of easy notice. He shared things. Not what he was planning. Not yet. But ideas. Questions. The kind of questions that, once asked, are very hard to unask. What if the attention given to these humans was something that could be taken? What if the connection between creator and creation was something that could be broken? What if the power that flows through that prayer system could be redirected? 7 others gathered around him in the beginning. Then more? Not because they were evil, exactly, but because Lucifer was extraordinary, because his voice carried that weight that other voices simply did not, because when he spoke about something, it sounded not like rebellion but like wisdom. Like finally seeing what had always been true but never quite said out loud. God knew. Of course God knew. The one who holds all things together does not miss the turning of a single heart in the farthest corner of creation. But God did not immediately intervene, because intervention without choice is not love, it is control. And the Creator had never been interested in control. He had always been interested in something much more costly and much more real, relationship. And relationship requires the genuine possibility of walking away. What happened next was swift and devastating, not because it was unexpected, but because it was complete. The rebellion that had been forming in whispers in quiet meetings burst into the open, and the beauty of Lucifer, which had always been one of the most extraordinary things in all of creation, could not survive contact with what he had chosen to become. Pride that has fully formed into rebellion does not get to keep the face of the light bearer. The change was immediate, and it was total. The fall from heaven is one of the most dramatic moments in the entire story. A long, shattering descent through space, past stars and planets and the vast architecture of a universe that had been built in beauty. The being who fell was still powerful, still brilliant, still possessed of all that fierce intelligence and strategic capacity. But now that power and intelligence were oriented in an entirely new direction. Not toward worship, not toward service, toward conquest. Toward the one goal that had taken root when he first watched God walk with the humans in the garden and felt the first stirring of something he had never experienced before. Toward revenge. He landed in a dark and empty wilderness far from the celestial courts, and he rose from the dust, and everything about him had changed except the intelligence and the memory. He remembered everything, including every word he had ever been taught in those throne room sessions about prayer, about how it worked, about what strengthened it and what could break it. He remembered it all. And now, for the first time, he knew exactly what he was going to do with what he knew. The garden was not far. The humans were still there, still innocent, still walking with God in the cool of the evenings, still laughing and talking with the ease of people who have never known fear or shame or loss. The perfect targets, not because they were weak, though they were, but because of what they represented. They were the thing he had watched God love in a way that had shattered him from the inside. If he could take them, he would not just be winning a battle, he would be striking at the heart of the one who had cast him out. He moved through shadows toward the garden, and what he brought with him was not an army or a weapon in any conventional sense. What he brought was knowledge, specifically, the knowledge of how the prayer connection worked, of how it could be interrupted, of what it was vulnerable to. He had been taught all of this in the throne room of heaven. He had listened so carefully, and now he was going to use every single word of it. The conversation in the garden was short, precise, surgical in a way that only someone with deep knowledge of the target could manage. He did not come in with accusations. He did not come in with obvious lies. He came in with questions, subtle ones, the kind that create just enough doubt to begin the work. Did God really say? Are you sure about that? What if there's something you're not being told? And there it was. The first crack. Not a break. Not yet. Just a hairline fracture in the surface of perfect trust. But that was enough, because he knew from everything he had been taught that doubt was the single most effective disruptor of the prayer connection. That fear interrupted the golden threads. That unbelief dimmed the light. He had been told all of this by God himself in those early sessions, and he had remembered every word. Now he was using it exactly as he had planned. The moment the fruit was taken, something in the cosmos shifted. In the heavenly realm, the golden threads of connection that had run unbroken between creator and creation since the beginning flickered, for the first time, and then dimmed. And the being watching from outside the garden felt something surge through him that he had not felt since before the fall, something that felt, for one terrible moment, like triumph, but then he heard something he had not expected. Not the silence of abandonment, not the sound of the connection going permanently dark. He heard God calling, not with anger, not with the voice of a commander issuing judgment from a distance, with grief, the voice of a parent whose child has just done the thing they were warned not to do, and the parent knew it was coming, and it still breaks the heart, because love doesn't stop at the border of a bad decision. Where are you? 2 words, and in those 2 words, the entire nature of what was happening began to reveal itself, because that question was not the question of someone who didn't know the answer. God knew exactly where they were. He always did. The question was an invitation, a reaching toward, a refusal to let the broken connection become the final word, a reaching across the fracture that had just been made, not with condemnation, but with the willingness to begin the work of restoring what had been broken. The one watching from outside the garden felt something shift in his chest, something that was not triumph, something closer to unease, because the response he had been expecting, the complete severing of the connection, the final darkness, the God who turned away in disgust and left these humans to their consequences, was not what he was watching. What he was watching was something else entirely, and he could not yet name what it meant. Then came the words that changed everything, spoken into the garden in the presence of the fallen humans and the serpent and the one who had animated the serpent. A prophecy, a promise. One will come who will crush your head. Simple, devastating. The one standing outside the garden heard those words and felt, for the first time since the fall, something that his vast intelligence immediately tried to suppress. Fear. Just a flicker, but real. Because he knew what those words meant. Not specifically, not yet, but he understood enough to know that the plan he had thought was finished was not finished, and the connection he had thought he had broken was not broken. The system he had studied so carefully, the prayer system, the golden threads, the pathways from earth to throne, was still operational, damaged, altered, different from what it had been in the garden before the fracture, but operational, still reaching, still received. And that meant the war was not over. It had barely begun. Time is a river when you are watching history from outside of it. Centuries passed away, water passes over stones, smoothly, continuously, without announcement, and through all of it, the prayer connection endured, fragile in some places, strong in others, sometimes barely a whisper of a thread rising from a single desperate voice in a dark place, sometimes a column of light so thick and strong it was visible from the heavenly realm like a lighthouse in fog. He moved through those centuries with the methodical patience of someone who has all the time in the world and a very clear objective. He was not random in his attacks. He was precise, because he had been taught exactly what to target. He knew that doubt was the most effective disruptor, that fear interrupted the golden threads more reliably than any external force, that hopelessness could dim a prayer connection to almost nothing without the person even realizing it was happening. So those were the tools he used. Not fire, not obvious persecution. At first, whispers, suggestions, the quiet planting of a question in the mind of someone who had been praying faithfully. Is it working? Does God actually hear? What's the point? Why keep speaking into what feels like an empty sky? He used these the way a skilled craftsman uses precise instruments, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of the effect he was producing. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes a voice that had been rising toward the throne went quiet. Sometimes a golden thread that had been climbing steadily dimmed and then went dark. And when that happened, he felt something, not exactly satisfaction, more like the professional acknowledgement of a craftsman who has done their work correctly. One less connection, one less voice, one more human who had decided that prayer was not worth the effort. But there were others. There were always others, and some of them were harder to silence than anything he had anticipated. There was a man named Job. You need to understand something about Job before you understand what happened to him. He was not a man of ordinary faith. His faith was the kind that had been built by years of consistent practice into something with structural integrity. When he prayed, the thread that rose from him was not fragile. It was dense with accumulated trust, thick with the weight of a life lived in deliberate awareness of the divine presence. It was, from the strategic perspective of the one watching from a distance, a problem. The test of Job was not an accident. It was a calculated move. He had gone before the heavenly court with what he believed was a compelling argument. These humans only pray when life is good. Remove the good things, and the prayer connection collapses. The faith is not real. It is just gratitude for comfort, dressed up as something deeper. He was confident about this. He had watched enough humans in enough dark places to believe he understood the pattern. God's response was not what he expected. Go ahead. Test him. See what the faith is actually made of. What followed was devastating by any standard of human experience. Loss upon loss upon loss, arriving with the relentless efficiency of a plan that had no mercy in it. Job's wealth, his children, his health, his standing in the community, one by one, systematically removed. And the one watching from a distance watched with focused attention, waiting for the moment when the prayer connection would finally break, when the voice that had been rising steadily for years would finally go quiet. It did not go quiet. And this is the thing that neither Job's friends nor the watching adversary fully understood. The prayer changed. It became more raw, more honest, more desperate. It stripped itself of formality and showed the thing underneath, which was something fiercer and more real than the polished daily practice had ever been. Job did not pray less when everything was taken from him. He prayed harder. He prayed with everything he had. He prayed in ways that were uncomfortable and sometimes even bordered on accusation. But he kept praying. He kept the line open. He refused to let the connection die. From the heavenly perspective, this was not what the test was supposed to produce. The prayer from Job in his suffering was arriving at the throne in a form that was, if anything, more powerful than what had come before it. Not because suffering makes prayer more spiritual, but because suffering that produces honesty, rather than silence, strips away everything false from a person's relationship with the divine and leaves something that cannot be manufactured in comfort. Something real. Something that the throne receives differently than the pleasant and easy prayers of a life without pain. He stood back and watched his best strategic move produce exactly the opposite of what he had intended. Job's suffering had not broken the prayer connection. It had deepened it into something he genuinely did not know how to counter. Then God spoke from the whirlwind, and Job, who had been demanding answers with the desperate anger of a man who had nothing left to lose, fell silent. Not because his questions were answered. They were not, really. But because the presence that spoke from the storm was so completely beyond the categories of his argument that the argument simply dissolved, and what replaced it was something that looked a lot like the original garden. The simple, overwhelming reality of standing in the presence of the one who made you, and finding that it is enough. Job was restored, and the one who had designed the test stood in the distance and looked at his hands and began, for the first time, to wonder whether he had made a serious miscalculation about the nature of prayer. Centuries more passed. The river of time kept moving, and the promise from the garden moved through it like a current running beneath the visible surface. Something was coming, something that the ancient prophecy had pointed toward with words that still landed like stones in water, rippling outward through generations. One will come. One will come. He tracked the prophecies. He could not help it. His intelligence would not let him ignore information about something that might be a threat. He listened to the prophets in their wilderness places and their temple courts, speaking with voices that carried a weight they themselves did not fully understand. He noted the patterns. He filed the details, and as the picture became clearer, a strategy began to form. If one was coming who could crush his head, then the solution was obvious. Stop the one from coming. Or if that was not possible, stop the prayer connection long enough to prevent what was coming from having any effect. If he could break the faith of enough people before the moment arrived, maybe the promise could be interrupted. Maybe the prayer network could be dismantled to the point where the thing the promise was pointing toward would land in silence, without the faith response that was necessary to complete it. He worked through generations, Empires rose and fell partly as a result of his management, not because he controlled everything. He did not, but because he understood human patterns well enough to guide certain tendencies and directions that served his purposes: pride, fear, the hunger for power, the willingness to treat other humans as less than human when the strategic advantage seemed clear. He was an expert at these. He had studied them for centuries. And yet the prayer network held, smaller in some areas than others, pushed underground in some places and sometimes, but never fully eliminated. Always there was someone, in a desert tent, in a besieged city, in a prison cell, on the deck of a ship, in the upper room of a house in a city that did not know what was coming. Always someone with their lips moving and their heart open and the golden thread still rising. Then the night came, the night that was different from all other nights. In a garden, again. The irony of it was not lost on him. A garden, again. The place where the first fracture had happened was now the place where something was reaching its culmination. The man who knelt among the ancient olive trees was praying with an intensity that was unlike anything in his experience as a watcher of human prayer. The weight of what was coming was visible in every line of that kneeling body, sweat falling in the moonlight like drops of blood, the words reaching upward with a desperation that was also, underneath everything, an absolute and unshakable trust. He circled that praying figure with everything he had: fear, loneliness, the anticipation of specific suffering. He knew what human minds could hold and what they could not. He had been studying it for centuries. He pressed every available instrument against the prayer in that garden, hoping to find the fracture point, the place where the thread would finally thin and break. An angel came, not to remove the difficulty, not to take away what was coming, but to strengthen, to pour into what was already there enough endurance to continue. And the prayer continued, and the thread held, and he stepped back from the garden with something in his chest that he could not name and did not want to examine too closely. What followed, he believed, was his victory. The rest in the garden in the dark, the trial that was a mockery of justice, the crowd that chose exactly as crowds often choose, with the loud voice of fear, and the short memory of people who want to be on whatever side feels safest in the moment, the cross rising against a gray and heavy sky, the darkness that fell in the middle of the day as if creation itself was flinching from what was happening. He stood beneath that cross with something as close to triumph as he had felt since the very beginning, and he raised his hands, because this, he believed, was the moment. The one who could crush his head was being destroyed by the very mechanisms of the world he had spent centuries shaping. The prayer from the garden had not saved him from this. The faith of every person who had ever prayed faithfully had not prevented this. The golden threads of the entire prayer network could not stop what was happening on that hill above the city. And then a cry went up from the cross that shook the foundations of everything. A prayer unlike any other ever prayed in the history of the human voice. A prayer of complete abandonment and complete trust. Existing in the same breath, in the same agony, at the same time. The most paradoxical and the most powerful prayer ever lifted from human lips. And the thread of that prayer rose into the darkening sky and did not break. He did not understand what was happening. Not yet. He watched the burial. He watched the sealed tomb. He watched the guard stand